morning, everyone. Welcome to the Carsey Policy Hour, and thank you for joining us. I'm your host, Melinda Negron-Gonzalez, and it's a pleasure to welcome you to today's discussion on what's ahead for K-12 public education in New Hampshire. Here in the Granite State, the data present a striking paradox. On one hand, one analysis showed that New Hampshire's schools recently ranked 5th in the nation for overall quality, including strong performance in reading and math. On the other hand, when it comes to who pays for education, the state ranked last in the country for its share of funding going to K-12 public schools. This tension, high relative outcomes, but deep structural funding inequities raises urgent questions. And we are joined by two experts this morning to answer those questions. We're joined by Reaching Higher New Hampshire Executive Director, Nicole Heimarck, and their Director of Policy, Alex Tilsley, who bring deep experience in educational policy, research practice partnerships, and the evolving landscape of schooling from pre-K through post-secondary. Over the next hour, we will explore key policy developments and funding trends shaping K-12 public education in New Hampshire, pressing issues for students, families, and educators, including equity, teacher recruitment and retention, and adaptability in an evolving schooling environment. And we'll have an early look ahead to the 2026 legislative session and what might be on the horizon for state and local education policy. Our aim here is not only to inform, but also to prompt meaningful discussion this. I should mention that the Carsey School of Public Policy at the University of New Hampshire is independent and nonpartisan. The school is nationally recognized for rigorous and actionable research, housing 4 research centers, and the Carsey School educates tomorrow's leaders through its professional master's programs offered both online and in person in Durham. So do check out our website for more info on Carsey Research Centers and graduate programs. I'd also like to take a moment to thank our series partners for the Carsey Policy Hour. Our partners are the New Hampshire Municipal Association, New Hampshire's Bureau of Education and Training, the New England Sustainability Network, and the New Hampshire Association of Counties. Following the presentation, we'll open the floor for questions and discussion, so do feel free to submit comments and questions during the presentation using the chat feature. You'll find the chat button on the center left of your Teams screen, and the chat is open and visible to everyone. So please do, in the spirit of civil discussion, avoid inflammatory remarks, and do identify yourself in the chat when you offer remarks or pose questions. Okay, so without further ado, let's get started. I have the great pleasure of introducing our two expert speakers from Reaching Higher New Hampshire, Nicole Heimarck, Executive Director, and Alex Tilsley, Director of Policy, who bring deep experience in educational policy, research practice partnerships, and the evolving landscape of schooling from pre-K through post-secondary. So I will hand it over to Nicole and Alex.
Thank you for that kind introduction, Melinda. Good morning, everyone. My name is Nicole Heimarck. I'm the Executive Director at Reaching Higher New Hampshire, a nonprofit based in Concord, New Hampshire, that really tries to advance equitable education for all our students. With that introduction, I'm going to pass the baton over to Alex to offer her introduction while I pull up our slide deck for this morning.
Hi, everybody. I am Alex Tilsley. I am the Policy Director with Reaching Higher New Hampshire. I've been in this role, just for context, for just a few months now, so really diving into all things New Hampshire. I'm sure all of you on this call know more about this than me, have things you can tell me, have things you can teach me. So looking forward to sharing what I know and learning from all of you along the way.
Okay, thank you, Alex. I'm going to jump right in and lead us through our brief slide deck so that we offer you all ample opportunity for Q&A at the end of this presentation. To begin, I really just want to highlight how important our public schools are to our communities, and that public schools really are an essential public good and thrive when they are supported by their communities and our state. It's really this deep belief belief that drives the work at Reaching Higher New Hampshire. We come to the table today with a great deal of conviction that this dialogue is more important than ever as we highlight what happened last legislative session in our policy environment and what we're forecasting for the 2026 legislative session, which will be beginning in just a few months. We are grateful for the opportunity to share our work and really that deep belief in public education. So highlighting some of the work we do, as I shared, we are a Concord-based nonprofit working to ensure that all young people have access to high-quality public schools, regardless of where they live in New Hampshire. Our work aims to translate really complex policy into really complex policy issues into clear and understandable information aimed at empowering our families and our communities so that they can better engage in both the policy environment and also with their public schools. By connecting people and policy, we support informed, really well-informed advocacy and collaborative efforts that advance this idea of equitable education in both opportunity and outcomes for all students. You can see highlighted here on the screen some of our key pieces of work that we've pushed out in really how to strengthen our public schools, how to engage students and school boards and the policies that impact them most, on the factors that most impact public schools and student learning, and then real high quality information on the educator workforce and what keeps them in the profession. So with that introduction, I also want to ground this dialogue in who attends our public schools. And I think it's really important for us to acknowledge who they serve. And by and large, public education is the choice of the vast majority of our families and students here in New Hampshire. 9 in every 10 Granite State student attends their local public schools. Again, underscoring their importance to community, to their neighborhood, but also to our state as a whole as we work to grow the future generation of engaged citizens. You can see that we have about 451 district-operated public schools in the state of New Hampshire, some with public preschools, 10, 293 elementary schools, 70 middle schools, and 79 high schools. In addition to that, we also have a system of chartered public schools. And I think it's important to note that our charter school system is part of the public school system. And at this point, we have 31 public charter schools in New Hampshire and then approximately 132 private schools throughout our state. So in highlighting that and thinking about the fact that 9 out of every 10 students attend our public schools, we also want to begin naming some of the core issues that are facing our public schools. And it's really key to speak to how needs of our population, of our student population, but our population as a whole in this state is changing. In some ways, they're increasing, but they're becoming increasingly complex. And so you can see in the last few years that we have seen an increase in the percentage of students qualifying for school meals. These are students navigating poverty and oftentimes come to school hungry or go home on weekends, not knowing when or where their next meal will be. In addition to that, we see an increase in students qualifying for individualized education plans. This is a complex issue for our schools and a key responsibility for public education in providing the necessary students for all students to succeed. And lastly, one of the largest sort of growing areas of New Hampshire's population, really noting that we're in a period of declining enrollment in our school-aged children, but growing population has been an increasingly diverse population here in New Hampshire. And that's really underscored when we begin to look at the number of students qualifying for English language learner students so that they can engage in our schools and engage in our society. So at Reaching Higher New Hampshire, we have been at this work for about 10 years. We were founded in 2015. So 2025 is our 10th year anniversary as a nonprofit advancing public education in New Hampshire. And a mainstay of that work has really been identifying the core issues that face our public schools. And to tee up today's presentation, I'm really going to highlight 3 core issues, but I also need to be responsible and state that these 3 core issues are terribly intertwined and integrated into one another. So while we're going to highlight 3, it's important for us to note that they have a deep relationship to one another. And the first, which I don't think the audience will find surprising, is just the ongoing inequitable and underfunding our public schools have faced across decades, almost 5 decades to be exact. And more recently, really since the pandemic, we're seeing an increasing emphasis on privatization efforts to really privatize our public schools and efforts to dismantle or disassemble our public schools. I'll also note that public schools are not the only ones facing this dismantling or disassembly. We see that happening with other public institutions across our country. And the third piece we're going to speak to briefly today, really setting the context and setting the ground, is the increasing presence of culture wars in our schools and the increasing presence of ideology coming into our classrooms. So those are the 3 issues I'm going to highlight as I take some time to look back on 2025, and then Alex will be carrying the baton to carry those forward in what we're forecasting in 2026. So starting with underfunding of our public schools. I know, or I imagine, that this is not a surprise to most people on this call this morning. Said simply, funding really does matter for our schools and our communities. It matters in how much is offered to our schools, and also equally as important is how it is distributed across our state to ensure that all students have access to a fair, equitable, and adequate public education. Our state, as many of you know, has had an over-reliance on local property taxes. And what that yields is an imbalance or a variance in educational opportunities by community or by neighborhood for our students. Schools do not have the same amount of funding available to them to pay for things like their infrastructure, such as school buildings, their teacher salaries, curriculum materials, extracurricular activities, and more. And that really has created an unfair system for public education here in New Hampshire. We also are well informed by a substantial body of research that shows school funding matters have an impact when done well. And really the 4 factors that states should consider as they're designing or revising a school funding model is what is adequate, what is equitable, what is responsible, and what is transparent. And what that means is adequate funding should be sufficient to support a rigorous, high-quality education for all. Equitable funding should be targeted based on student needs with the goal of closing opportunity gaps for all youth. Responsible is that school leaders should be trusted to use the resources in the way they know works best for their communities and their population. And transparent is schools and state administrators and legislators should all be accountable for providing the appropriate resources so that students can thrive. We also know that expenses across our school districts vary greatly. And as I've previously highlighted, there is this over-reliance on local property taxes here in New Hampshire when we fund our public schools. And you can see at the bottom of this slide, we draw a comparison across 2 communities here in New Hampshire. One is Auburn, New Hampshire, and one is Newcastle, New Hampshire. And we see a stark contrast and what can be provided in delivering a high-quality public education to the students that live in those communities. communities. So when we speak about variance, I really want to highlight that difference between those two communities that sits on this slide. I also want to take a moment to highlight that according to a recent Supreme Court ruling, New Hampshire underfunds its public schools by at least, and I want to emphasize the term at least, $500 million each year. This slide speaks to where the different revenue dollars come into a school district to fund their public education. And you can see the pie chart highlights the over-reliance on local property taxes, with the state giving about 28% of that funding and then about 7% coming from the federal level. And we're going to dig into some more details from the state and federal level in the next couple of slides. But moving on, we've seen it play out in the media time and time again about the underfunding of New Hampshire's public schools. And we really see a lack of revenue to fund our public schools in the way they need to be. We've seen a Supreme Court, multiple state Supreme Court decisions be handed down on the need to increase and to adequately fund our public schools, and really our legislature's refusal to follow or respond to those Supreme Court decisions. Lastly, I also want to highlight, as we look at some of these headlines that have played out in the media, there is a new and emerging threat to school funding, and it also relates deeply to privatization, and that is open enrollment, where students can enroll in any public school in the state despite the community that they live in. And there was this recent state Supreme Court ruling on open enrollment, which we will dig into later in this presentation. So when we begin to think about what threats exist as we look at the different buckets of money that are available to our public schools, I'll begin with the threat to local funding. And really over the next two slides, I'm going to focus on the threats that exist at the local level and the federal level, because they're really actively having an impact here and now, and as we forecast the 2026 legislative session. So as we look at the threats that have emerged on local funding, so the funding that comes out of our communities through taxation, we see proposals to cap budgets for school district operating budgets. We also are in a phase where we are implementing a new law that was passed last legislative session that requires the posting in the aggregate of student proficiency scores on budgets. We continue to see a downshifting of expenses to local budgets, and then naturally the local taxpayers with what the state provides. And we see increasing uncertainty as we go into the 2026 legislative session. Next, I also want to speak about threats from the federal level, because we would be remiss if we didn't highlight this. And I know when we showed you the pie chart of what comes from the federal level, it doesn't seem like a significant amount. It's about 7%. But as you all may know, on June 30th of 2025, the Trump administration withheld federal entitlement dollars that go to our public schools, being dollars that support students navigating poverty, be it dollars that support teacher learning and teacher professional development, dollars that support safe schools through Title IV. And this really created an upset in our ecosystem this summer. On the screen, you see a quote that came from a local superintendent highlighting really the impacting of the withholding of the 7% of federal funding that comes into our state. Reaching Higher at the time decided to do an analysis of the impacts and sent out a survey to our School Superintendents Association. And we have a wonderful post on our website that really details what some of those federal threats and, more importantly, what some of those impacts look like. But the delay in this federal funding really created angst in our communities, We're also looking at proposed congressional cuts in federal education dollars through the congressional budget, which is still making its way, and our team will be briefed on the latest iteration later on today. And then just a general uncertainty and unpredictability in what the role of the federal government will be in funding public education. We had learned when this federal withholding emerged in June of 2025, it was really a test. It was really an effort to test to see what the impact would be. And as we all know, those dollars were eventually released, but they were not released without impact. So the next theme, threat 2, is really the privatization efforts that we have been tracking here in New Hampshire. And beginning this school year, New Hampshire has a universal school voucher program, which really aims to divert state funding away from our public schools, because the funding for that school voucher program comes from our education trust fund. With eligibility expanding to universal vouchers, we are seeing and hearing, in fact, there was a headline just last week that it's going to cost the state approximately $51 million this year alone in increasing eligibility to all students across the state. A couple of facts about our EFA program. When this program was first adopted, it was billed as a program to serve students navigating poverty, students coming from low-income families, in an effort to give them more opportunity. Each year, we have seen proposals to expand that eligibility, removing the focus from students navigating poverty to all students. And when we unpack those students who are taking advantage of the voucher program, we find that a vast majority of them are students who were never enrolled in our public schools. So what that means is this program is serving students whose families or students had already decided to never enroll in public education, and we're going to pursue private models from the beginning. The last piece I also want to highlight about our voucher program, because it highlights another theme that really began to amplify in our legislature last year, is just this overwhelming opposition that we track to some of these efforts, one being vouchers, but vouchers not being alone, but our lawmakers really not listening to the will of their communities. And I'm trying to speed up a little bit because I want to make sure Alex has time to speak about the 2026 session. So the last threat I'm really going to highlight that we're tracking as a theme is often categorized as culture wars, or we could say competing visions for society that undermine public institutions. And we've seen these culture wars not only emerge in K-12 education, but higher education and other public institutions across the nation and across the state. And in fact, just last week on November 5th, we saw that the New Hampshire House Education Policy and Administrative Committee voted along party lines in a 10-8 vote to pass an amendment to Senate Bill 33. Senate Bill 33 now aims to reinvigorate efforts to limit the books, the content, the curriculum, the artwork, the performances our students can engage with and our teachers can teach within the classroom. It is important that I remind folks on this call that this effort to reinvigorate sort of a book ban in essence, but I want to emphasize it's bigger than a book ban because it hits other content beyond the books available in our classroom, was a bill vetoed by our governor, HB 324, in June. So despite overwhelming opposition from our communities to push back on efforts to ban books in our classroom, and despite the governor's effort to really highlight that this was not the place for government to intervene, our legislature is continuing to push forward legislation and policy that really limits what students can engage with and what teachers can teach with in our classroom. And whether this bill is successful or not, it's also necessary to name that just by having having these proposals make their way through our policymaking bodies, the impact is already felt. The idea of book bans really creates a chilling effect in our classrooms, and we hear and we know, and research abundantly supports that educators and teachers tend to censor more and more in environments where these conversations are being had. In addition to book bans, we've seen bathroom bills be proposed in our legislation. We've seen a really strong effort to ban DEI, which our state Supreme Court stepped in. This case is still active and making its way through. And lastly, I want to highlight that we're tracking efforts that increase liability for both educators and school districts if these policies are passed, creating private rights to sue, in addition to the fact that we have an educator code of conduct and an educator code of ethics that are often tapped or tied to these efforts to really stifle speech in our classrooms. So with that introduction, and I'm sorry, I feel like I ran through the end, I'm going to pass the baton to Alex so that she can speak to what we're expecting in 2026.
Great. Thank you, Nicole. And thank you, everybody. So as we look ahead to 2026, as I'm sure most people on this call know, I just want to situate us in where the legislature is. We're entering the second year of a biennium, which means that the budget was done earlier this year in the 2025 session. We don't need to do the budget again. It also means that a lot of the ideas, a lot of the legislation from 2025 is sort of still hanging out. As Nicole mentioned, right, we've seen efforts to reinvigorate some bills that maybe were talked about early and then we hadn't heard about in a while. Right now, this fall, we see the committees are meeting to make recommendations on all of the retained bills. So the House Education Funding Committee actually meets tomorrow and has, I think, a list of at least 10 bills that they'll be deciding whether to move to the House floor. And these are all bills that were introduced in 2025 that maybe were retained in committee, maybe they had a floor vote, but then were sent back to committee. So all ideas we've heard before, they're currently deciding what to move forward. So some of the things you hear, if they sound familiar, they probably are. We've also seen this fall some non-germane amendments. So essentially where the legislators use an existing legislative vehicle to pass something that might be a little bit different, that might be totally different. Last week in the House Education Policy and Administration Committee, we saw them take HB 131, which had been a bill about cell phone use, and they amended it to be a bill about responses to bullying. So some of these non-germane amendments really do change the context. And similarly, we're seeing them being used to kind of bring back ideas that maybe didn't get traction the first time around. And at the same time, they've also been filing legislative service requests. So we have about 200 legislative service requests related to education entering the 2026 session. For those who aren't intimately familiar with the legislative process, those legislative service requests, or LSRs, are essentially titles of bills that we can expect to see in 2026. At this point, we really only have titles. So a lot of what we're doing is talking to folks, trying to understand what this actually means, what this legislation might look like. In some cases, we can get there, and in some cases, we have bills that are called relative to education finance. And so sometimes we have to just wait and see. But based on what we've seen in the committees and based on the LSRs, these are some themes we're seeing. And I'll touch on each of these a little bit and then go into a little bit more depth on a few of them. And these are a lot of themes because there's a lot of bills. 200 LSRs is a lot, and they span the gamut. They come from all sides of the aisle. So responses to Claremont, which you see at the top here, I'm sure most on this call are familiar with the financial crisis facing the Claremont public schools. And we've seen legislators on both sides of the aisle introduce bills or LSRs to try to avoid future situations like Claremont, to change how the state handles situations like Claremont. So we see bills about audits. We see bills that would give voters the ability to require an audit from their school board. We see bills that would require the state to take a more active role in situations like this. It's not clear that any of these bills actually respond to the current situation, and frankly, not clear whether they would have helped prevent a situation like Claremont in the first place. I think we're still figuring out what happened there, but this is certainly top of mind for legislators. And I think we're going to see a lot of conversation about audits, about receivership, about different options for districts in crisis. Funding, of course, is a perennial issue, and this is one we'll go into more depth later. But as Nicole mentioned, there's been some response to the Supreme Court ruling, and so we actually see that in some of these bills coming forward. We have bills, resolutions that would say the state is not beholden to the Supreme Court ruling, and then resolutions saying that, in fact, it is and needs to fund education adequately. There are attempts to change both revenue and expenditures from both sides of the aisle, and this year is particular focus on special education funding. On alternative pathways, this is things like vouchers, like open enrollment, like charter schools, which Nicole touched on and we'll cover in more depth later, but essentially attempts to broaden the options available to students and also attempts to require more accountability and transparency. On the continued culture wars, Nicole previewed this, but some of the bills that didn't make it in 2025 are back. And I think that one thing that is maybe a growing trend is this issue of educator liability and a private right of action. So one LSR title, at least, would prohibit school districts and personnel from the instruction of critical race theory and LGBTQ plus ideologies, as well as establish a private right of action for violations. And of course, we only have bill titles, but that certainly sounds like if a teacher talks about LGBTQ plus issues, they could be subject to a lawsuit. And that not only affects the learning experience, but it affects the willingness of educators to speak about critical issues that our students need to learn about in the world, and ultimately could have a chilling effect on the educator workforce at a time when we need more teachers in our schools. So that's a trend we're definitely watching closely. On discipline, we definitely see a movement to mandate responses to bullying. And of course, bullying is a growing issue, unfortunately, and with cyberbullying and different access to social media, something schools are increasingly grappling with. But a lot of what comes out in this legislation are methods that the advocates and the experts who really study this say are probably not the right ones to prevent bullying and to make long-term change. And so there's this tension here between the legislators wanting to do something about bullying, wanting harsher punishments, and the schools and the districts really wanting to be able to honor the local expertise and the expertise of the educators and employ the methods that they think make most sense in that context. And then finally, local control. This is a kind of a broad bucket we're looking at, but there are a number of bills that sort of attempt to either take some control away from our school boards, to dictate how they have to do things, to politicize school boards. And it's something that, again, we see as a trend and that could really maybe not have immediate impacts, but certainly have impacts down the road to how our schools are run, to how much say local voters have in their public schools, and to whether public education remains something that everybody values, that isn't a partisan issue, that isn't limited to folks on one side of the aisle. So thank you, Nicole. On funding, this is, as I said, is one of the key themes we are tracking. As always, as with every session, we see bills that attempt to increase spending. We see bills that want to curb spending. There are both revenue and expenditure bills, right? So bills about how much we spend and how we decide who gets what, and about where to get that money from. And I think that particularly in a non-budget year, any bills that require the state to spend more money without a mechanism for generating that money are unlikely to go far. There's often this pushback that we can't talk about revenue, right? The budget is already done. We see different approaches to funding formulas, attempts to define the cost of the adequate education. Across the aisle, there's a shared interest in lowering reliance on property taxes, just different approaches to doing it. So the Democrats tend to introduce legislation that would lower reliance on local taxes by increasing the state share, where the Republicans tend to introduce bills that would just decrease the amount we spend on education. There was one interesting development this fall. Representative Spilsbury, who is a Republican, mentioned that he is going to introduce a bill, and we've had this LSR that would increase the statewide education property tax and pool it at the state level. And I won't go too deeply into those mechanics right now because I know we're short on time. But essentially, this is a change that a lot of advocates on the school funding side have been pushing for a long time. I think everybody at the moment was surprised to hear this bill come from a Republican-led committee. And so we're interested to see what happens with that. I think there are some signs that people really are taking the school funding crisis, for lack of a better word, seriously, and are going to start talking about ways to fix that. Whether that has a future in this session, I think is probably unlikely, but I think it's an important conversation for us to have. Also in funding, the local spending caps are back. Voters and at the local level will have a chance to decide this year if they want to implement a spending cap. And there is, once again, a bill held over from 2025 that would mandate spending caps at the local level. So essentially say no matter how much revenue you're able to raise, you can only spend a pre-calculated amount on education. This was wildly unpopular among voters in 2025, which was why the bill didn't move forward, but it is back this year. There's also an attempt to implement budget caps at the SAU level, which for those who maybe aren't as familiar, we have some kind of SAUs are school administrative units that combine a bunch of districts. We have a bill that would cap their budgets, and it's not clear what that mechanism looks like when it falls across districts, but there is this attempt from the state to limit how much local money boards can spend. And then this concern about special education funding. There's been a study committee this fall really digging into the cost of special education. It's been rising in part because services are getting more expensive, in part because more students are being identified for special ed. The committee seems to really be digging into why more students are being identified. And I think the theme that observers have noticed is it sounds like we're looking to maybe offload some of these services to DHHS rather than keeping them in the education funding system. This is something that advocates are really, I would say, concerned about. There are federal laws in place requiring that we provide a appropriate education to all students, regardless of their disability. And it is important that as a state, we continue to honor that and continue to ensure that all of our students have opportunity. So this is certainly something everyone is watching closely. We don't yet know what legislation will come out of that committee. On vouchers, and I will speed up so we can get through questions. There's legislation coming on vouchers. This year, we expanded access to vouchers or to education freedom accounts, as they're known, to anybody regardless of income, meaning that families who were already sending their child to private school could now access a voucher for roughly $5,000 to use toward their tuition. There was a 10,000 student cap this year. That cap was met mechanically based on the legislation that was passed. That cap will now go to 12,500 students. Naturally, we have some LSRs that would get rid of that cap entirely. We also have LSRs that would try to allow localities to opt out of the EFA program. That one is unlikely to pass. And we have LSRs that try to at least add some accountability and transparency to the program. So without necessarily changing who can access it or how many vouchers we provide, there are some attempts to get a little bit more data about outcomes, about how the money is being spent, about whether these programs students are spending money on actually lead to good outcomes. I think that we could see some mixed votes on vouchers this year. Certainly, some people are worried about the cost. This year alone, it cost $51 million, which was more than $10 million over the projection. And if we get rid of the enrollment cap, of course, that will go up. And so I think that there are enough people worried about the cost that we might not see every bill expanding vouchers succeed. And we included this chart here just to make the point that vouchers are not popular, but to Nicole's point about legislators not always listening, or not in this session, not usually listening to their constituents, it hasn't seemed to matter so far, but we think with the cost, maybe this year it could. And then the next slide, and then the final theme we're tracking, is this idea of dismantling public education. And of course, you see charters on this list. Charters are public schools. Local control exists for public education. But there are a number of bills that really attempt to change how we think about our public schools, to change the way they work, the way they function as part of our communities. So open enrollment is the big one, and Senate Bill 101 was retained from 2025. This bill would introduce statewide open enrollment, meaning parents could choose to send their child to any public school in New Hampshire, regardless of where they live, as long as that school has open seats. And open enrollment is, and in that context, I think it's important, given the Supreme Court decision that came down a couple weeks ago, the local district, the student's home district, would pay tuition to the school they're going to. So if a student lives in Concord, which is where I live, but wants to go to school in Merrimack, Concord pays that tuition to Merrimack. Open enrollment is something that exists in a number of states, most of them, in fact, and does exist in some form in New Hampshire. But broadly, and we have some research because it exists in other places, broadly, it works best when the schools are pretty equally funded and when there's more centralization of funding. If the schools are all about the same, but maybe have different focuses, or maybe one is more convenient to a parent's commute, whatever the case may be, there can be advantages to it. But in a place like New Hampshire, where our schools are funded at wildly different levels, given local property wealth, what's likely to happen is you'll have a small number of schools that are destination schools, with everyone fighting for seats in those. And then you'll have other districts that nobody's trying to get in. They're just losing students. They're paying other districts to educate their students. And with the declining enrollment we see, that could cause a real financial crisis for those districts who are sending students elsewhere. It is also really unpredictable. There's no way to know in any given year how many students might try to go somewhere else. And so it's creating a level of chaos. It is draining students and draining money from our schools. And of course, too much depth to go into here, but there are fixed and variable costs in education. And just because 2 or 3 students go somewhere else doesn't mean you can hire fewer teachers, right? So suddenly at the school that folks are leaving, you still have the same expenses, but you have less money coming in to fund it. And so we're really concerned about what this means in a context like New Hampshire's. These other items, charter conversions, there is one bill that would turn every public school into a charter school. I don't think this will happen. I don't think these mechanics have been thought through, but I highlight it because it shows that legislators are really are not placing the value on public schools that we would hope. And then SAU consolidations. This is a committee that's been meeting and has recommended consolidating SAUs at the district level, despite the fact that recently we've seen districts wanting to leave SAUs rather than join them. So again, just not necessarily reflecting the will we're seeing on the ground. And finally, local control. You've heard us talk a bit about this, but there are a lot of potential changes that would take the power away from the voters in these districts that care about their public schools. And then I'm going to jump quickly to beyond the legislature. Of course, there are decisions at the local level facing voters, facing school boards. We are in school budget season. School boards will need to decide about open enrollment. Voters will need to decide about spending caps. A lot of potential action there. At the federal level, as Nicole previewed, things are chaotic. And a lot of districts are thinking about what they might do if these funding streams they've come to rely on don't come through. It's a small percentage of money, but in a state like New Hampshire, every dollar counts because you can't count on the state to provide it. And then finally, at the state level, you may have heard that we have a new commissioner of education. People are, I think, anxiously awaiting to see what kind of department this will be under Commissioner Davis's leadership. We've also seen a movement toward more legislating through rulemaking. So the State Board of Education has really played a more powerful role in the last few years, and that's something that we are continuing to watch. And finally, I'm going to preview really quickly something that is making us optimistic, and we hope will make you optimistic too. Because so much of what's happening in the legislature is really focused on trying to take funding and influence away from the public schools. We at Reaching Higher New Hampshire are hoping to reframe the conversation a little bit rather than constantly just talking about budgets and about proficiency scores, which is something we didn't go into, but happy to talk about offline because those are going to appear on all of your local ballots. We think those things are important, but we also think we've really maybe lost sight of what makes a high quality public education and how we make our public education system even better. There are very few bills in those 200 this year that are actually designed to make the classroom experience better for students and for teachers. And so we are beginning to talk to district leaders and to all stakeholders about what they think makes a high quality public education in hopes of building a framework for both evaluating legislation that's coming out about as to whether it helps advance that vision, but also helping to shape proactive legislation that could advance this high quality public education, whatever that means to us in New Hampshire. So we will drop that link in case anybody wants to weigh in, but happy to talk more about that project. And with that, I think I need to wrap up because we are over our time and I see questions in the chat. So thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Nicole and Alex. So much information, so important. Really informative. Thank you so much. We have some questions and I encourage others to go ahead and drop your questions in the chat. If I may start off with just a question on budgeting. Can you help us understand budgeting and unpack the school funding budget and how policymakers determine what the budget should be? You mentioned fixed and variable costs and that sort of thing. And so I'm trying to understand what, the state contribution should be, in your opinion, as experts.
So it's a great question because I think part of the challenge in New Hampshire is that we use a measure that doesn't actually really tell us. So we rely on cost per pupil, which effectively is how much money the district spent divided by the number of students they had. And that we kind of take as that's what it costs to educate a pupil in that district. Of course, the amount of money you spend depends on how much revenue you have, right? So it's not necessarily that it actually costs significantly more, significantly less from district to district. It's just that they had different resources. It also means that as your attendance fluctuates, your cost per pupil also fluctuates. Doesn't mean that it costs more to educate those students, right? In the open enrollment context, if a couple students leave, your cost per pupil is going to go up because your costs won't change. But it doesn't mean it costs more to educate those students, just that you had fewer students. So I think the reliance on that metric can be a problem. The state has really determined the amount it funds students based on inflation. We saw in this budget just a nominal increase, not necessarily actually accounting for costs on the ground at all, just taking what they've always paid and increasing it slightly. And that may, of course we want to account for inflation, but doesn't always account for the realities on the ground. And as Nicole said, New Hampshire, and as we started off this presentation, right, New Hampshire's last in the share of state funding it provides to schools. So you could argue that their methods are not ideal. Nicole, I'll let you add.
Yeah, when you first said the question, Melinda, I had the impression maybe it was centered more at the district level. And as somebody who had worked at the district level in setting budgets at the district office for 10 years, I can sort of share sort of the mechanics of what that looks like. And so often an assessment is done of fixed and variable costs. So you can imagine like the first expenses that land in a budget and are easiest to populate are those fixed costs. So looking at contracts, so like school busing contracts, looking at contracts for teacher agreements, whether they're 1 year, 2 year, 3 year, 5 year teacher agreements. Then additional costs roll in that are kind of border both fixed and variable because they are need to have. So like health care for employees, and those are usually wound up in contractual obligations, but we know healthcare has been an increasing at crazy rates. In fact, I think like the projection this year is 12% on most health plans. So looking at what those plans are and then factoring in the variation in rate increases from year to year go into budgets. Then the other piece of the budgeting is really built around community values and the mission and vision of the school and the school district itself. And curriculum cycles and adoption cycles. And that's when we really get into the instructional materials for students, the supports for teachers, and what is needed to ensure, the vision or mission is realized, in addition to, what is the focus for the school district, whether they have a strategic plan or not. And then resources are usually concentrated based on sort of those guiding documents that school districts often have.
Thank you for that. That really helps me at least understand a little bit better. Okay, we have some great questions in the chat. Thank you, Anne-Marie Timmons. Anne-Marie is asking, how much authority does the state legislature have over what special education services are required? And or are there any changes at the federal level that would allow state lawmakers to revise IDEA protections and requirements?
I think that I would put all of this in the context in that we have seen the state legislature pass legislation on things that they don't necessarily have authority over. We have some instances where federal law and state law do not align, and it creates problems in our schools. Special ed is not one of those places yet, but I don't know that even if they don't have the authority, I don't know that that is necessarily going to stop some of the legislation that we anticipate coming this session. Right now, there are not changes to federal law that would allow state lawmakers to revise IDEA. Of course, things at the Federal Department of Education are really messy right now, and the chances are there will be less enforcement, which could open the door for non-compliance that wouldn't result in pulling federal funds. We've also heard some lawmakers question whether we need federal funds and have made the point that if we didn't accept federal funds, we wouldn't need to follow federal laws. I don't expect that change to happen this session, but it is something that they're openly talking about. And if we decided that and that's not, I don't think that is a decision that the state legislature could make unilaterally, but again, that hasn't necessarily stopped them in the past. Certainly, if we decided not to accept federal money, that would really change the requirements around IDEA protections. So I feel like it's a non-answer, but I think really I would still be concerned about these things, even if legally, technically right now that authority doesn't exist.
Great, thank you. Looking in the chat, we have a question from Brent Powell about how people understand what high quality education means. So does high quality education mean high student engagement? Brent asked, thanks for the question, Brent. What sources do you draw on to know the answer to this question?
Brent, I love that question, and I want to commend you for picking up on that slide and really how we're trying to shift the dialogue and really move to a positive sort of proactive approach to public education. So I recently met with our School Superintendents Association to launch this effort. And what we shared is we know that school districts are doing incredible work. And so often that work is not broadcasted. And so in this effort to define a high quality public education, we're beginning that work or anchoring that work on what our school districts have already done. So for example, we know that numerous school districts across the state have engaged in a project known as Portrait of a Graduate, which really is sort of a backwards planning model for our students, envisioning their K through 12 experience and what a successful graduate looks like at the end of 12th grade, the day they walk across the stage. So that is an example of a document or an artifact that can really highlight what a high quality education looks like in a student when they get there. We also asked superintendents to really consider their missions, their visions, their community values, their school values, their strategic plans, because when they engage in that type of work, they are in fact mapping out what a high quality public education is. So we're currently involved in the process of like collecting those artifacts, but also having the conversations with school superintendents, with school principals, with school board members. School board members are an essential ingredient in this conversation. And then we'll be going through the data, going through the artifacts thematically to pull out the themes, to begin to cast that vision based on what is happening in school districts right now and the work that they've already done, but also combine it with what research also tells us of what a high quality public education is. And there is abundant research out there, and really to try to create a vision for the state of New Hampshire based on community level, neighborhood work, and what the research says.
Thank you for that. That sounds like super interesting and, of course, super important work. Okay, I'm looking at the time. If you could answer in 20 seconds a question from Stephen Bird about the disconnect between public opinion and legislature action, what's going on there? 20 seconds.
Okay, I'll try, because I've done this, and I'll try to dive in quickly. There is a phenomenon happening in New Hampshire where we are seeing an increasing presence of national special interest. And I think this is one of the factors that is causing this circumstance. And we see the presence of special interest here in New Hampshire for a number of reasons, but I'm going to highlight two. One is our legislature is so large. It is the second largest legislature in the world, which makes the ratio of lawmakers or decision makers to constituents really, really low. And so it makes our lawmakers very, very accessible. It is easy to connect with a lawmaker. In fact, I was at a forum last week where people were joking, saying, you know, everybody knows a lawmaker here in New Hampshire. Everybody knows probably more than one lawmaker here in New Hampshire because our legislature is so large. So that's factor one. Factor two is also that the New Hampshire legislature, as of now, they could try to change the rules, holds a public hearing on every bill that is proposed. So what that means is that any bill proposed has its opportunity to be heard. It gets airtime. And so that really creates sort of a attractive environment for national special interests to come and test ideas here, and they are in fact doing it. And then oftentimes we see those ideas exported out from New Hampshire. I think that was a little longer than 20 seconds.
Interesting. No, it was, but that was great. That was a great response. Thank you so much. Okay, so folks, thank you all for joining us, and thank you to those who contributed really thoughtful questions, and thank you for the discussion, Nicole and Alex. I've learned so much this morning, and please do join us for the December 10th Carsey Policy Hour, where we will talk about affordable housing with Emmy Ham, who's the executive director of the Workforce Housing Coalition of the Greater Seacoast. That's December 10th. Thank you all again. I'll see you at the next Carsey Policy Hour.